When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our west coast became a potential combat zone.
Beyond Heart Mountain is a story about the history of the Japanese residents who thrived in downtown Cheyenne on West 17th Street. They lived and worked there beginning in the 1920s. The two-block area declined in part due to racial injustice towards Japanese during and following World War II. The community was finally dispersed by the 1970s. Since then, the neighborhood has been very quiet. There was renewed interest in the once vibrant Japanese community by a housing development planned to be built at 509 West 17th Street, site of the last building standing. The Lotus condominium project in the new Nishigawa neighborhood was a renaissance of sorts for me. I realized that there was much that I had forgotten about my past and want to remember it. I wonder what kind of ancestor I'll end up being. While there were many prominent Japanese families in Cheyenne, this focuses on those who had a presence in the West 17th Street downtown community. My stories and point of view are included to provide context and also because my family lived and worked in the neighborhood. The story tells about the importance of social cohesiveness among a community of people and how that relates to fostering and maintaining a sense of place where we can all live, work, and play. I interviewed 4 of my childhood acquaintances who had a presence in the Japanese neighborhood in West Cheyenne. We were COVID distanced in an online Zoom room. Terry Miyamoto's family owned Baker's Place. Her Aunt Marge is one of the last surviving members of the Nisei generation from Wyoming. Both now live in Denver.
It's a part of Cheyenne's history that we treasured because we were a part of it, and we knew the people and families that lived in it and that supported one another. And I think that's pretty much gone. You don't see communities anymore where they're a homogeneous kind of ethnicity anymore. They're pretty diverse.
Robert Walters and I first met as Sunday school students at the First Presbyterian Church. He's now an attorney and lives in Cheyenne.
Even though there was a Japanese business community there, it was really not Japanese owned or owned by Japanese people. So, but those were people that were very hardworking, and they were a strong pillar of the community. But like a lot of things in Cheyenne, things that seem to be staples have disappeared.
Brian Matsuyama is older than me. He grew up in Cheyenne but now lives in Washington State. His family owned the California Fish Market.
I wouldn't have been born, I don't think, had it not been for the war and relocation. There would have been no reason for my mom, who was born in Auburn, which is south of Seattle, would have been no reason for her to ever go to Wyoming, where she met my dad, had they not been relocated.
Carolou Kishiyama Huff and her family purchased the California Fish Market from the Matsuyamas. She's a shirt-tail cousin of mine. Her sister Jean married my dad's brother Jake. Carol still lives in Cheyenne.
I just keep hoping that things will change around as far as the racism and the bullying. It seems like it's all flared up again. I was in the grocery store when the COVID all started, and I was in line, and this gentleman behind me said very, very loud, "You know, it's the Chinese that have started all this, and that's why we're going through all this." I just turned back around, but he said it again and louder. And I thought, I'm 70 years old and I'm still going through this.
This story is a personal and cultural survey of the once vibrant 400 and 500 blocks of West 17th Street in downtown Cheyenne, which included businesses like Baker's Place, owned and operated by the Miyamoto brothers and their African-American partner, Johnny Baker.
Baker's Place was my grandfather Tomizo Miyamoto's bar restaurant, and he was in partnership with Johnny Baker, who was an African-American businessman there in Cheyenne. And my grandparents lived above the bar. They had a 2-bedroom apartment, and I know my parents lived there for a short while.
Tell me about Johnny Baker.
He lived next door to us. Was a black guy that owned the bar that later the Miyamotos took over. As a young kid, and again, left Cheyenne pretty young. And as a young kid, my hours and Johnny's didn't really coincide, so didn't see a whole lot of him, but he seemed like a really nice guy and was a good neighbor.
I grew up with Linda Miyamoto and Terry, so we would ride our bikes all over town, and we'd go to the Wild Theater, and we'd go to Rodell's.
My Aunt Marge, who's sitting with me, she was there with their youngest son, Bill Miyamoto, and their younger daughter, Linda Miyamoto. And they lived there quite a few years, huh, Aunt, above the bar.
Yeah.
So this is Margaret Miyamoto, and she's my aunt. She was born on May 17th, 1928. So she's 92. And she is the last surviving Nisei Miyamoto that we have in our family.
And Linda and Doc and Marge lived upstairs from there. So I remember going up there and staying with Linda, and then going during the day and helping Doc clean the bar.
Can't really remember a whole lot about him.
I don't think anybody can. I can't find anything about Johnny Baker anywhere, anything. So it's very odd. There are some people that are just like ghosts.
I remember what he looked like. Kind of a white fringe around a completely bald dome, and a little bit on the heavy side. Was, as I say, he seemed like a very nice guy and was a good neighbor.
It was the only integrated bar in Cheyenne at the time, frequented by the likes of Sammy Davis Jr. when he was stationed at the nearby Warren Army Base.
Who helped you? A man in the Army. I could read, but I couldn't write. And Sergeant Williams was his name. And I started reading.
What was the first book you ever picked up and read? You know what it was?
Three Musketeers.
The Three Musketeers.
The Japanese community gathering place was the City Cafe, owned and operated by Mrs. Shuto and her nephew Tommy. The pork noodle bowl was my favorite, and still is given a choice when eating out in any Japanese restaurant.
I was born at Warren Air Force Base. My dad was stationed there when my mom had me. I don't really have any memory of it. I just know that that's the case. When my folks divorced, when I was entering in 7th grade, we moved off base. We'd lived in military housing, and then went to McCormick Junior High. And it was about that time that my mom got me a job at City Cafe washing dishes. And so that was my introduction also to Tommy Shuto, who was the proprietor of City Cafe.
We would go there at least once a week, or we would do takeout. And I know my grandparents were very good friends with Mrs. Shuto, who was the owner, and Saiki-san, who was the cook.
You know, City Cafe was really more of a continental restaurant. It had some Chinese dishes, chow mein, fu young, but it had some what were called Japanese dishes, which really were recipes that were somewhat modified to attract the American consumer. I mean, you didn't have sushi, you didn't have ramen.
Went to the City Cafe pretty often. That's probably of the times we went out to eat, only 90% of those times was at the City Cafe. And my dad was pretty close with Miss Shudo and Saiki-san. I think he would often go down there to help them if they needed translation or doing paperwork and things. And whenever he did that, he'd always come home with a bag full of hamburgers and French fries and Cokes for the kids that they would send us.
Tommy was a shrewd businessman. He knew what his customers liked and he made it, but he also did things like a prime rib and lobster, pot roast with gravy and carrots and potatoes. So Tommy didn't feel like he needed to convert people to real Japanese food, and certainly Japanese food that he grew up with.
We'd always get the pork udon, which you never really can find anywhere. Same kind of udon that Saiki-san made. And my brother's favorite was the breaded veal. He loved the breaded veal. Or we do the teriyaki. We'd always get teriyaki. Those were kind of the mainstays, though, that we would get.
I remember eating in the booths in the front of the cafe as a family, and we often ran into other Japanese families when you'd go in there. Then there were some times when the cafe was closed that they would be hosting smaller groups of people in that back room.
I can remember they had the booths in the front and the counter, and then you could go through the kitchen, and in the kitchen there was a tree growing through the kitchen eating area, and then there would be a back room, which was a community room where you would like community dining, because they just had big long tables that you just shared your meals with, and there'd be doctors and lawyers, people of all diverse backgrounds eating together there. So, and it would be a wonderful place too, where sometimes I think they show Japanese movies there too.
And the kids would sit around the jukebox out in front. Miss Shudo would set it up so that we could play anything we wanted, and that was a super treat. So I remember a couple of times doing that with other kids.
Well, we always went there on, I believe it was Friday nights, to watch the old Japanese movies. And all the kids and the women would sit in the restaurant and watch the movies.
On weekends after hours, the City Cafe was hopping. The Shutos hosted big community gatherings. Black and white samurai movies played in the front, while drinking and card games were played in the back.
Tommy drove this El Camino super sport, back in the day when it was not looking like a truck, but it functionally was like a truck. It was very useful to him, and he taught me how to drive. He didn't live very far from me, so I would usually stick around the restaurant, wait for him, and then we would leave.
Then there were some times when the cafe was closed that they would be hosting smaller groups of people in that back room. I remember times when we would go in there, and I think it was probably the Okamoto boys and Ted Miyamoto's kids. My brother and I, all the adults would be in that back room doing whatever they were doing, socializing. And
it almost was more like a family atmosphere than anything else. I mean, none of us were related. But there were Japanese, I think he tried to hire as many Japanese people, women in particular, to work either as waitresses or in the kitchen, as far as dishwasher. He just he was happy to help out kids who were in junior high and high school who had Japanese parents.
There were other businesses in the neighborhood that included a barber shop owned by the Matsushimas, a California fish market owned first by the Hashimoto family, then the Matsuyamas, and later the Kishiyamas.
I do remember the fish market. I remember the layout. Walking in the front door, counter on the right, there was a Coca-Cola tub. I don't know if you would probably know these better than me, but a Coca-Cola tub with Coke in it, sitting in cold water. Of course, in the fish market, plenty of ice. So I think my dad probably kept that there because it was kind of a hangout for some of the Nisei guys would come in and smoke a cigarette and drink a Coke and chat with him. And beyond that, there was a storeroom and small office. So I can kind of remember the layout of it. Didn't spend a whole lot of time there, obviously, as that younger kid, but I do remember going in there.
It's really funny because the only recollection that I have at the fish market was there was a black gentleman named Kokomo, and he used to just come to the fish market or sit on the corner. He was very disabled, but he'd come to the fish market and ask my dad if he could buy me. And I'd go run away into the fish market.
A Japanese market that also made tofu, operated by the Suzukis, and the pool hall owned by the Kubota family before my grandfather acquired it.
My dad and probably your grandpa and Okamotos and everybody would go to the pool hall. It was fun. We got to go into the pool hall once in a while, but not very often.
I never got to go in. And
you never got to go to the pool hall?
No, I had to stay outside, or because my dad would go restock the Coke machine like on Saturday and stuff, and I couldn't go in. Both of my paternal grandparents lived in the neighborhood and worked nearby. Their home, where they raised 12 of 13 sons and daughters, is now a vacant lot. The neighborhood never fully recovered from the racial injustices towards Japanese following World War II, including in Cheyenne, Wyoming.
When they were on the farm, I believe I've showed you the paperwork, and it said basically they were the enemy of the state. So they had to have Mr. Petch sign when they were leaving the farm, who was in the car, the make of the car, and where they were heading to. And then once they came to like Cheyenne or Denver or Scotts Bluff, they had to go to a county building or to the police or sheriff and check in and let them know where they were going.
All my aunties and my mom went to internment camps. So my mom from Seattle, her family was sent to Minidoka, Idaho there. And then my Aunt Marge, who's sitting next to me, her family was sent from Yuba City to Amachi here in Colorado. And my Aunt Connie, whose family lived in Los Angeles, they were sent to Heart Mountain in Wyoming.
That was the hardest thing to see. Mom was born in the States, she wasn't an immigrant, and all of her family was born here, and to be treated like that, it's still hard.
In my mom's case, I think it was a deliberate choice on her part not to introduce us very much to Japanese culture, except certain social events, and every once in a while it would come up in conversation. But that was pretty much my introduction to Japanese culture. I developed the interest after college, and when I moved from Wyoming to California.
Jeannie and Jake kept the New Year's Eve dinners and the cooking, and Jeannie was about the only one that kept going with the Japanese cooking. And I think that's because of your Grandma O, and the Highway Cafe and everything.
It wasn't until the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan that a formal apology was made to Japanese Americans. That law was shepherded by U.S. Senator Alan Simpson from Wyoming and California Congressman Norman Mineta.
Congressman Norman Mineta, with us today, was 10 years old when his family was interned. In the congressman's words, "My own family was sent first to Santa Anita Racetrack. We showered in the horse paddocks. Some families lived in converted stables, others in hastily thrown together barracks. We were then moved to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, where our entire family lived in one small room of a rude tar paper barrack."
The two met when Al was a Boy Scout growing up in Cody. His scout troop visited the Heart Mountain relocation camp where he met Norm, who was an internee and fellow scout. The two former lawmakers continue to be friends today. World War II was very jarring to my parents. They were even kicked out of the American Bowling Congress. The ABC eventually rescinded its exclusionary and racist policies. When the leagues were once again integrated, my dad's team won the city championship.
In, carry, strike, first frame.
There was no Japanese spoken around the house, and little mention of Japan by my grandparents.
When I was a kid in Cheyenne, within the house, we lived with my grandparents, and Japanese was spoken with them, obviously.
The whole language thing was so challenging. I think that she felt like it would be better for us kids not to have that complication, for lack of a better word. Now, today's thinking would be, gosh, a multicultural thing is a good thing.
Dad always wanted us to speak English. And we never hardly spoke Japanese unless Mom and Daddy were talking Japanese to each other. But he didn't want us to speak Japanese, I don't think, because of what he had to go through.
My parents and with their Nisei friends, it was always English, except when they wanted to talk and the kids couldn't understand. So there was no push for us to learn Japanese because that was their secret code. But there was not a push away from Japanese things either. We had rice every day, and we even had some Japanese records that I used to listen to. Some of them were from pre-war stuff, but Gunkan March and Shinado Yodo, which I later learned were really pretty militaristic. But so it was not an attempt to shield us from Japanese, but I think my parents were Americanized. Well, some of our younger brothers had gone into the 442nd in the Army. A couple of older brothers were released to go work on farms in Warland. And she was released to go to cook and keep house for them. Got on a train, went to Cheyenne, where she got off, and I suspect that must have been a change to a bus or something. But it was night, and she went to a telephone booth to take a look at a book and see if she could find any Japanese names in there so she could get a recommendation for a hotel to stay. And she found Takahashi's. gave him a call, and Marie told her to stay where she was, and Marie came down, picked her up, took her home. As you knew Marie, I think, didn't you? Not surprising in her, but anyway, took her home. They became fast friends, and so my mother would come back to visit from New Orleans, and Marie introduced her to my father. So, had it not been for relocation, they would have never met, I'm sure.
My parents socialized me to be all-American. I didn't really even self-identify as Japanese either. I'm a third-generation Japanese-American and also a Cheyenne native. Back when my sister Lorinda and I were growing up in Cheyenne, being a baby boomer wasn't a thing. We were just kids. We had a big Cheyenne clan. This photo was taken in our backyard on Windmill Road, maybe at my sister's July birthday around 1967. My family being a part of the Japanese community, I've been wondering how my socialization is an example of why the neighborhood became an asphalt desert. When my grandparents and parents passed on, there was little cultural glue to keep my sister and me engaged as we went our separate ways with what few bites of Japanese culture we retained. For me, that's pouring shoyu over just about everything, including split pea soup. Throughout this story, you may notice the names Ohashi and Ohashi. How and why this happened are subjects of family lore. One possible explanation, in anglicized Japanese, the long O has a dash over it, and when handwritten, the dash may have slid over and was mistaken for an apostrophe. Ohashi means big bridge, as opposed to chopsticks in Japanese. The best explanation? My father was born on St. Patrick's Day, and some school principal changed his name in jest. Maybe it's a combination of both. But nonetheless, I've had this Japanese-Irish thing following me around since junior high school. In Wyoming, students learn about Wyoming history first in the 4th grade and then in the 7th grade. I don't recall learning anything about the World War II Japanese relocation camps in Mrs. Knutson's 4th grade class.
Training of children is difficult. Americanism, taught in the schools and churches and on the playgrounds, loses much of its meaning in the confines of a relocation center.
I learned more about dinosaurs and the prehistory of Wyoming. It wasn't until the 1980s, when I was living in Lander, that I learned anything about the Heart Mountain Relocation Center between Cody and Powell in northeast Wyoming. At the time, I was writing for a small newspaper called the Wyoming State Journal, published in Lander. A friend and colleague and I drove up to Park County to check out the place. At the time, it wasn't very well marked. I asked at a Powell gas station about it. "You can't miss it," the attendant said. "There's a tall chimney. Look for a turn off the road, and then after the railroad tracks, you drive up a big hill." When I first explored the ruins, the Bureau of Reclamation stored rolled-up fence in one of the abandoned barracks. Those original structures look much the same today. It's now on the National Register of Historic Places and maintained by a local nonprofit that oversees the grounds and a museum. After the war, some of the barracks were sold to veterans for a few bucks a building. Barracks were sold and moved all over the state, including north of Riverton. Those became the Cottonwood Cottages. The Heart Mountain Relocation Center was one of 10 camps set up around the country following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. World War II wasn't mentioned much around my house growing up. My mom told me how she and her classmates collected cans and bottles to support the war effort. Other than that, I knew that 3 of my uncles were World War II veterans. and I didn't think to ask them anything about their experiences. As I grew older, though, I understood the war intellectually, but I wasn't sure how I felt about it emotionally. Turned out, Japanese living in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, were deemed to be little threat to the national security. Besides, my parents were both native-born citizens. My dad was from Kent, Washington, and my mom, Thermopolis, Wyoming. My sister Lorinda and I are both Cheyenne natives, where we grew up in the 1950s through the 1970s. My immediate family didn't live in a camp, but my grandfather Ohashi and Uncle George were in California at the wrong time. My grandfather's truck farming business had grown to the point of having a storefront called the Western Growers Exchange in downtown Cheyenne. In addition to local producers, he directly sourced fruits and vegetables in the highly fertile and productive Central Valley of California. They were in Oxnard on a buying trip shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, President Franklin Roosevelt declared about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. After 10 years of international tension, the United States imposed trade embargoes to slow Japan's global expansion. That in part led to the bombing and the United States' entry into World War II. President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 in April of 1942, ordering Japanese mostly on the West Coast be uprooted and sent to one of the 10 relocation camps after processing at an assembly center. My grandfather and uncle were unable to return home when they found themselves stuck in the wrong place at the wrong time at the Tulare Assembly Center in Central California. The assembly center there was the converted fairgrounds. My Auntie Elsie worked with local, state, and federal law enforcement officials to get them back to Wyoming in 1942. By this time, my grandfather had forfeited his truck and lost his storefront. Had my grandfather and uncle been further detained, they would have been sent to a war relocation camp. They were like small cities, except for being hemmed in by tall barbed wire fences and guards armed with machine guns. There were recreation centers, baseball diamonds, places of worship, hospitals, and schools.
Some of the teachers are Caucasian. Some are evacuees, Americans of Japanese ancestry.
At the Wyoming State Archives, I came across a photo from the 1945 Heart Mountain High School yearbook. One of my biology teachers at Cheyenne East High School was Miss Jean Cooper. Before teaching in Cheyenne, she taught at the Heart Mountain High School. I was surprised she didn't mention anything to me about her teaching stint there. Scanning through microfilm copies of the 1990 Wyoming Tribune Eagle, there was a story about an anonymous teacher recounting her experiences at Heart Mountain. My dad's family came to Wyoming as typical turn-of-the-century immigrants and eventually ended up on the West 17th Street neighborhood that evolved into the heart of the Cheyenne Japanese community. My paternal grandparents, Toichi Ohashi and Natsu Yonago, were also known as George and Mary. They first settled in Alaska and Washington State. He brought his family to Wyoming by way of Monte Vista, Colorado, and began his truck farming business there. He started out buying vegetables from area farmers and resold them to restaurants. He also parked his panel van on roadsides and sold produce to passers-by. During the 1950s, my parents, Frank and Sumiko, were very involved in the Japanese-American community in Cheyenne. Just married with no kids, my mom was the first secretary of the newly established Skyline Nisei Club in 1950. It was formed in response to the racist backlash of World War II. Nisei is the term for second-generation Japanese born in the United States. Their Japanese immigrant parents were known as Issei. My generation is Sansei, and we're mostly baby boomers. The generation descriptors are derived from Japanese numbers, ichi, ni, san, and so forth. Back when I was young and a frequent denizen of the West 17th Street neighborhood, I took the area for granted, going there mostly with my parents. My dad worked for Coca-Cola, and I got to tag along on weekends and help restock the Coke products around town. I wasn't allowed into my grandfather's pool hall at number 516, where there was a Coke machine, for fear I might be exposed to the libertine men and scarlet women who frequented pool halls, and the music man Professor Harold Hill warned about. My dad made me wait at the door, but I remember the stale smell of tobacco in the room dimly lit by fluorescent glowing lights above each green felt table. I grew up with a big extended family. I remember having to give up my bedroom when my grandfather had to move in with us for a period of time. My maternal grandfather, Jusaburo Sakata, also came through Washington. His American name was Joe. He worked as a section foreman for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. When he retired, they lived a couple blocks from the Capitol building in Cheyenne. He later returned to Japan and married my grandmother, Toki Iwasaki, bringing her back to Wyoming with him. Half my grandmother's family immigrated to Peru. Peru was the first country to establish diplomatic relations with Japan. None of her Peruvian relatives were deported as a result of World War II. Many South American Japanese were interned in the United States at relocation camps. Their house was a great gathering spot during Cheyenne Frontier Days, when much of the action was happening downtown. My mom came from a much smaller family. Her older sister, Hisako, went to college at the University of Wyoming. She happened to work at the Warren Army Base in Cheyenne when Pearl Harbor was bombed. Their middle brother, George, kept up the family tradition and worked for the Burlington Northern Railroad. He was in a mixed-race relationship. He and Auntie Perry were married elsewhere, since that was unlawful in Wyoming up until 1965. He served in the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team.
This is a note I found from Tosh Suematsu that he'd sent to my mother. And he says, the impact of Pearl Harbor was softened tremendously as against the Japanese in Cheyenne, almost solely due to the high respect and credibility of Bill with the Cheyenne community and local officials. Bill was responsible for drawing this loyalty creed, which did much to calm the emotions and suspicions against the Japanese in Cheyenne.
It's a sad chapter in I think the nation's history, because it was something where people got caught up in the fervor about how a class of individuals could not be trusted. They needed to be put there. They were told that it was for their protection, but really, the history has told us that there were a lot of economic, political forces.
There was a feeling, certainly that my father had, and his younger brother, my Uncle Harry, many of his closest friends were early volunteers for the 442nd. So through the war, my dad would, I'm sure, have served too had he not had a heart condition. So for these guys, they felt they were American even before the war, and I think that they would have felt that way had the war not occurred. But there was that additional impetus to be American as well. Now, whether that influenced, how they brought up the kids, I never really felt any pressure to be an American. But I was just following their lead.
500 proud members of the 442nd Infantry Regiment, mostly American-born Japanese, swings down Constitution Avenue in Washington for another ceremony in their honor. There are 3,600 Purple Hearts in this outfit, earned in the bitter battles of Salerno and Anzio. Regimental colors are brought forward to receive the 8th Presidential Unit Citation held by the 442nd. Nisai hear President Truman's tribute.
You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you've won. Keep up that fight, and we'll continue to win. We'll make this great republic stand for just what its Constitution says it stands for, the welfare of all the people, all the time.
I didn't pay much attention to the Japanese community history in Cheyenne until researching this project. While my grandparents were alive, we had annual summer gatherings, generally during Cheyenne Frontier Days. Because the family was so large, I have slews of cousins. We were once close, but now live our separate lives, scattered all over the country. Because the Nisei and Issei generations are largely gone, we are rarely in touch, unless there's a death in the family. Soon we'll begin mourning ourselves. The Japanese population generally reflects the state's boom and bust cycle. Between 1900 and 1910, the Wyoming Japanese population increased from 303 to 1,590 persons, surpassing the number of Native Americans. That population increase is generally attributed to work available on the railroads and in agriculture. Following World War II, the Japanese population decreased significantly in part due to overt and institutional exclusionary policies like the Wyoming Alien Land Act that forbade land ownership by Japanese immigrants.
The Alien Land Act in Wyoming is an interesting creature because that did not get enacted till the Japanese were starting to be released from the internment camps. In Wyoming's case, I think the concern was if we don't enact the Alien Land Act, when these Japanese people start being released from Heart Mountain, they might decide to stick around, and then they might acquire property in Wyoming, and therefore it was kind of a scare tactic type of thing, I think, that was utilized at that time to justify that was the principal basis. Originally, the state of Wyoming was not all that excited about an internment camp being located in the state, but they, the area farmers benefited from it because they got all sorts of cheap labor, during harvest time. Japanese people would enter into lease relationships with property owners here in Wyoming. And I think that's true of, or it's my understanding that's true of a large number of businesses that were run by Japanese people in the downtown area around West 17th Street. You know, those were all owned by Americans who were willing to lease them out to, you know, different Japanese families who had developed, you know, some position of trust, hardworking, you know, good investment type of thing.
By 2010, the number of Japanese in Wyoming declined to 485 residents, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. While the population of Japanese has declined, more important is the sense of community that was lost. There was post-war urban flight by businesses to the suburbs, where residential growth was burgeoning. There are ongoing efforts to revive the area. It's been demonstrated time and time again that denser housing attracts retail and other amenities. The tangible things of downtown are much more interesting if there are stories attached to them. That's why the work of two of my East High School classmates is so important. John and his brother Jim Deneen are redeveloping a chunk of their family's former car dealership property into the Lotus townhouses. The last building standing at 509 West 17th Street was deemed by the local Historic Preservation Board as historic based on the once vibrant Japanese community there.
The building, while it's old, is not necessarily in great shape, but it is representative of a cultural area in the town. So maybe it doesn't make sense to preserve the building so much as to tell the story of the culture surrounding the building. After a hearing, the board allowed John and Jim to demolish the building with the understanding that a history of the Japanese neighborhood would be completed. I became involved based on my anecdotal knowledge of the area. The development is known as the Nishigawa neighborhood as an homage to the Japanese community. The new residents have a better understanding of the community story, and that better informs public and private efforts to revive all of downtown Cheyenne. By increasing the number of residents downtown, spending goes up, which sustains retail and attracts shoppers from outside of downtown, not just during business hours, but by the residents who are there all the time. That fuels the market for more housing, which improves the likelihood of downtown revitalization. My hope is that remembering my cultural past will provide stories to better inform the present about the history and how the future can be better because of it.
At each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity.
The incarceration of 120,000 Japanese during World War II was a far cry from being an opportunity. The action fanned the flames of racial injustice that smolder to this day.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
The president has ordered all travelers from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen to be denied entry to the United States for the next 90 days.
More seeds of racial justice will be planted, and some will take root. I hope that these stories beyond Heart Mountain can provide some nourishment for social change. As for myself, I knew I was getting old, but I didn't think it would happen this fast. I've come to realize while writing this story that there's lots about my past that I had forgotten, and it was good to be reminded about those experiences. Today, the old chimney and dilapidated buildings located outside Cody are just a pile of rubble. But for Japanese Americans like myself, who are a generation removed from the anger and hostilities generated by World War II, The ruins represent a legacy which will last far beyond Heart Mountain.
This brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told. The full story will begin to unfold when the raw lands of the desert turn green, when all adult hands are at productive work on public lands or in private employment. It will be fully told only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish, and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good.